I'm told that our break is over. So if everybody would be willing to take their seats, or at least quietly listen from the back. I think we're really lucky to have an excellent panel for this next session. So as soon as everybody sits down, or I'll introduce the panel. I'm Vicki Perry. I'm an assistant director in the Fiscal Affairs Department, and I'm delighted that I was asked to chair this group, the topic of which is essentially the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 and TADAT. How do they relate? So I have with me, going from my left right around, Mary Baine, who's the Director of Tax Programs for the African Tax Administrators Forum, and formerly head of tax administration in Rwanda. To her left, Bill Remington, who is Director of the U.S. Revenue Advisory Program in the Treasury Department, 2 blocks away. To his left, Marijn, who is lead economist in the governance and global tax practice at the World Bank and one of our primary counterparts. And finally, last but not least, to his left, Antje Pflugbeil, who is the tax attaché at the German embassy and is very involved in a lot of our tax work from the donor side, really. So without further ado, I'm just going to kick off by asking the panelists perhaps to go in order. First, just to give a brief assessment of their view of how does TADAT relate to especially developing countries in their experience. How can it relate to developing countries reaching the Sustainable Development Goals? How does it fit together? I know Mary has thought quite a bit about this, so I'll turn to Mary first.
Thank you so much, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this because the African Tax Administration Forum has been working very closely with the TADAT Secretariat, and TADAT has really made our lives a lot easier because it clearly spells out the areas that are needy for technical assistance, which is really the heart of our work, and it makes our lives easier. So I'm really happy to be here this afternoon. In my opinion, to answer your question, TADAT directly talks to countries' programs in terms of addressing the SDGs, in the sense that it spells out the areas that really need reform to bring in efficiency and effectiveness in terms of revenue collection, and therefore increases the much needed revenue. I mean, the number 17 of the SDGs directly talks about resource mobilization. If maybe if I use the African context, the Agenda 2063, the African Union Agenda 2063, which really also relates to the SDGs, talks about the same thing. So DRM, or domestic revenue mobilization, is the heart of attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, and therefore I think it's really, really the linchpin in the whole process. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. You know, if you think about interventions of donors, and we're one of the smaller ones, TADAT is described in POAs, outcome areas. But of course, after the outcomes come results and impacts. So you really have to think about what comes about from those 9 POAs. And you know, we often talk, in fact, it's almost always talk that TADAT has to do with increased revenues. I think that may be half of it, but probably no more than half. You know, Justin talks about systemization and non-routine activities and documenting, so that when you do a TADAT assessment, or when you undergo a TADAT, the real call is not about talk, it's for documenting the system that you operate under. And when you operate a tax administration according to system, what you avoid is unfairness, arbitrariness, kind of random shot activities that can create burden for firms and businesses and individuals that really are not justified. And you know, just teeing off from some of the things that Jim Alm talked about, TADAT really has to do with fairness and with even-handedness. And so if you think about how that relates to the SDGs, these, I think, are direct effects of TADAT. Well, some of the SDGs are work and growth. You know, if tax administration is not even-handed, if individuals are paid under the table, they don't benefit from social benefits. Growth, of course, depends on the certainty of costs for businesses, and as that becomes less uncertain, there's less investment. You can talk about inequalities, and of course, you think about after-tax inequalities, and TADAT, one of the benefits of TADAT is it reduces that. So those are just the direct effects, I think, of good tax administration. And of course, there are indirect effects on reduction in poverty, health, education, and so on, in terms of tax administration providing the wherewithal to fund those activities.
Thanks, Bill.
All right.
Marijn.
So I'd like to first go to a higher plane and look at the relationship between the overall tax system and the SDGs. And we happen to have had a very nice conference back in February, organized by the Platform for Collaboration on Tax. So that's the IMF, the OECD, the UN, and the World Bank. And it was in New York at the UN headquarters. And some of you were there. And we discussed exactly this issue of how does tax relate to the SDGs. And we did some analysis around that, and we found that out of 17 SDGs, 11 actually relate to tax. They're dependent on your tax system. So 2/3 of the SDGs are in some way or another related to tax. So that's a lot. Now, if you think about it, so why is that true? Why is that in so many areas? There's really 4 ways that you can think about how taxes influence the SDGs. The first one, everybody is aware of. You need to collect revenues as a source of funding for development activities. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 has to do with, it doesn't just matter how much tax you collect, it matters how you collect it, because that has an impact on things like economic growth, equity, and other very important factors of how the economy performs in terms of promoting SDGs. The third pathway is one that relates to the incentive effects of taxation, and particularly incentive effects that relate to behavior that has a direct impact on the SDGs. So think about environmental taxation. A main idea around environmental taxation, or let's say tobacco taxation, is not the generation of revenues. It has to do with changing behaviors. You have a really good tobacco tax if it leads everybody to stop smoking, right? That should be the real idea. So that has to do with behavior and incentive effect. And finally, and here again we go back to something that came back in earlier sessions, particularly Jim Alm talked about it, which is the relationship between the government and the taxpayer and society as a whole. It's a trust factor, it's the governance factor. Tax, if you go back in history, there are quite a few wars that were fought over tax, had something to do with the creation of this country. So taxation is apparently really important when it comes to the relationship between the government and its citizens. So it's important to have it right. So that's the tax system. That's not necessarily the tax administration, and that's not necessarily TADAT. But I think if you work creatively, you'll probably find that all the POAs, in some way or another, have something to do with the SDGs. Now, I want to now say something that in a way that would supplement the TADAT. So one, if you look at the relationship between the tax system and the SDGs, a key part of it is the perspective from the taxpayer side, right? So when you talk about, for example, the incentive system, if you talk about the governance aspects of it, it's really about the perspective of from the taxpayer perspective. TADAT refers to that. A lot of the POA areas have to do with how can you organize your tax administration in such a way that it interacts better with the taxpayer, but it doesn't really ask the taxpayer. It goes into how the tax administration works, and it then makes some certain presumptions about how that affects the relationship with the taxpayer, which may or may not be true. And I think there was an interesting element that came out of the discussion earlier about why are reports not published, and one key reason being, well, the results are being politicized. So it's not just about you do good as a tax administration, you treat your taxpayers fair, and that's good enough. No, there's probably a political aspect in it, there's probably other aspects in it that you don't really realize that really have an impact on how the tax administration performs in terms of its relationship with the taxpayer. So that's just a thought. That's not something that you want to build into the TADAT necessarily, but it's something that over time you want to complement the TADAT with. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That gives us quite a lot of food for thought. Antje?
Yeah, first, before I start, I also want to thank the Fiscal Affairs Department and the TADAT Secretariat for this wonderful event here. I myself have been a member of the Technical Advisory Group since 2013, so I was involved in setting up the field guide. I remember the lively discussions that we had at that time with different perspectives coming together. And from that perspective, or from that angle, I want to echo the remarks that have been made and point out 3 POAs which figure into this idea that we had to also look at the acceptance of a tax administration for the taxpayers. And so if you look at POA 9, obviously the accountability was a very big issue, and it's very good, Marijn, that you also mentioned the taxpayer perspective needs to be considered. And then the other thing is POA 3, we discussed a lot about it, how much information does the tax administration shall give to the taxpayers so that they are able to fulfill their filing obligations, their compliance obligations. And then if you think about what was discussed today, a very big issue was the POA 7, the effective tax dispute resolution. So for taxpayers, it's just very important that their rights are also taken into account, and that they can, if they think the tax administration interpreted the law in a different way that from their perspective should be done, that they have a way to also go through it. And so that all figures into this accountability, institution building, and acceptance of the administration, which then may hopefully also increase the compliance from the taxpayer side.
Thanks. As I say, I think that gives us quite a lot to chew on. One of the things I wanted to do next was throw in yet another acronym to go with SDGs and TADAT, which is the Medium-Term Revenue Strategy, MTRSs, that some of you may have heard about. I might turn to Marijn first for that, and he can explain it rather than me. But I think there's a link. When we were discussing among ourselves, well, how do we link? What's the linkage? That is, we've just stated what some of the linkages are, our panel, but how do you bring that linkage home? How do you use it? How do you build on it? How do you make it effective? And that led us to raise the question of these medium-term revenue strategies, which I think Marijn was going to have something to say about, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so I think I'll first then have to explain what it is for those of you who haven't seen the concept already, which may not be many, because we've been talking about it quite a bit over the last couple of years. So the medium-term revenue strategy is a mechanism for governments to build a country-owned, that's not just the government, that includes all the stakeholders in the tax system, a country-owned strategy for dealing with the comprehensive issues in the tax administration, in the tax system. So this goes beyond the tax administration, it goes beyond TADAT, it relates to tax policy, it relates to the legal system, and the idea is that if a government is able to formulate a truly country-owned approach to solving the issues that are in the tax system, administration, policy, legal, that allows this government to then rally all kinds of stakeholders around that effort, and basically not domestic stakeholders, but also let's say supporters of capacity development from the outside, organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, bilateral donors, and they can all come together around a comprehensive, multi-year, country-owned program of activities that will bring about real integrated reform. And one of the core aspects that probably will come up in this discussion is this idea of that this should be a whole of government type of approach. You're not looking at just one part of the government, which sometimes in our work we tend to do because we have an entry point. We have a tax administration as an entry point for tax administration, a Ministry of Finance as an entry point for tax policy, and in practice, bringing all of that together is not necessarily a straightforward affair. So the idea is that all of these things come together. So that's really on what the MTRS is. And from my explanation, I'm pretty sure it's kind of obvious that a TADAT is a great starting point for an MTRS. And we're discussing, of course, the concept quite a bit these days with all kinds of stakeholders. And one question that frequently comes up is, okay, shouldn't we have it as a principle that you really cannot start an MTRS discussion if you don't have a TADAT that kind of gives you a starting point? It gives you at least an overview on the administration side of what are the relative strengths of weaknesses, and also gives you a benchmark against which you can measure progress over time. So maybe that is enough for others in the panel to build on.
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit. I think you're following on what was just said about what the MTRS is. One of the kind of things that are needed to create it is a consensus building around all the actors, and of course what the people that are involved in the consensus want to know is why. I mean, why are you proposing a particular revenue strategy, whether it's revenue increase or change of who has to pay and who doesn't have to pay, and so on, the revenue policy and the revenue administration. So in terms of getting that consensus, you want to know what are the social benefits of a tax system. And so as a consequence, to me, the MTRS should tie TADAT. In other words, what are you going to do to improve your tax administration, and why are you doing it? So in an MTRS document, that ideally would be contained. I mean, I think we only have one kind of completed MTRS, and it touches on the link between development and expenditure and revenue, but it's not fully developed. So I hope that further ones will develop that linkage between social needs and who pays for it.
Well, I wholly agree with what has been said, and I think the MTRS and the TADAT tie in very well together, especially given that the TADAT actually provides after the diagnostic, or after diagnosing the elements that are the weaknesses and the strengths, the next step then becomes the sequencing of the solutions. And I think when you look at the MTRS and how it is structured, then that sequencing that has already been identified by TADAT would then enable governments and all the other stakeholders to be able to come up with a plan that shows what the quick wins would be, what the medium-term actions to be taken should be, and what the long-term elements should be to sustain, for instance, the domestic resources, and also to determine what plans and what development areas need to be addressed before, one before the other. So the sequencing then enables governments to plan better and enables the stakeholders to be able to inject whatever they need to make the whole development plan work. So I agree that the TADAT work directly fits into the MTRs, as a plan. And I would give an example, say, of a country like Liberia, where they're having this. One of the key elements they had to do was to go around and try to determine what the needs were in the different provinces. But if, say, that TADAT had been done, then it would have provided that, straight away to show what the problems are, and then they'd only come in to say what they need to do to address those problems. Yeah, so they do tie in together.
One of the things that we in the Fiscal Affairs Department and the fund, together with other parts of the fund, the area departments especially, the country teams, are working on is a methodology for trying to ascertain, quantify what some of the costs would be to attain certain of the SDGs as a practical matter. How much would you expect to have to spend as a percentage of GDP in order to reach sort of a good performance in the SDGs? And that methodology will obviously, that ties into the MTRs also, of course. So once you figure out, part of the MTRs is, as was said, trying to figure out what are the needs, what are we raising the money for when we're improving our tax administration? Why are we doing that? We're doing it partly to raise money, and we need to know why we're trying to raise the money. And that takes me, I think, to my next question, which is, with respect to the tax administration itself, how do you see the possibility of incentivizing or even just informing participants in the tax administration? And Mary, you may have thoughts about this from all your various experiences, but how do you see the possibility of, during a TADAT or as in light of a TADAT, kind of explaining to, incentivizing your people, the actual tax administrators, to realize what SDGs this affects? How, I mean, they don't have to know the numbers, obviously, but what aspects of a strong development plan to achieve governmental development goals are they working toward?
Okay. Well, to answer your question, right now, if you see the way this work is done and how governments operate, at least in most of the developing countries, you find that people actually operate in silos, so to speak. So those who are in the health sector do their work, those who are in environment do their work, those who are in education do their work, and the revenue administration just raises revenue. So I think at a national level, or if I may use the example of a national level, it would be really helpful if there was a task force that, or a steering committee. Let me talk about a steering committee that would then have the holistic elements of the SDGs that have to be attained, and then to explain how the revenue that is collected, how that revenue actually enables that whole program. So if it is to do with the health sector, and they say the revenue administration needs to collect so much revenue to then make it possible, I think that would help the people in the revenue administration to link their work to social development. But as it is done quite mechanically. I'll give you an example of where I come from in my country, Rwanda. When we used to have a national task force that talked about the Millennium Development Goals. And whenever we came in, everybody said, well, because of what you are able to do, we were able to take more children to school, we were able to treat more women, and as such, we reduced the mortality rate. So actually, when we were doing our tax education, both the tax officers and the taxpayers were encouraged to hear that what they were doing was having direct impact on the social fabric. So I think there's a lot that could be done through that dialogue and through the fact that the evaluation of what has been done, the accountability of government, to say that we've collected so much and we've used it on health and the other elements, goes a long way in encouraging the revenue administrations to work even harder and to be even more targeted in what they do. So, yeah.
I saw some nodding down the line here, so. Antje.
Yeah, and also maybe from the experience with the field guide, a lot of elements that you find in there are not specific to tax administration, and we are just speaking about the HR component in the revision of the field guide. I mean, once that's set up, it sure is a good way to think about what can you do in HR development concepts and in other administrations, not specific to tax.
Mm-hmm.
I know, POA 3, kind of literal terms, it talks about informing taxpayers about their tax obligations. Mm-hmm. But you really could go beyond that. You should inform taxpayers about why they should why they should meet their tax obligations in addition to how. And I know many countries have public media relations on informing the public about tying their tax obligations, as Mary said, to the social needs. And I know Fund in Myanmar is doing something similar in publicizing to a very kind of low compliant environment to drum up support for paying taxes and improving the government and the society.
Marijn.
Yeah, just maybe a little bit of a different note. And so I think, so one of the things is if you really want to be able to understand the taxpayer's perspective here, maybe in some cases there's something that we need to do differently, right? Because right now we have these awareness campaigns, and they're typically very slick and very nice, and they explain really well why people should be paying tax, and that's fine. But what about the tax officials themselves, right? Because why you should pay tax interacts with a lot of other things. It also relates to the services that you get, and it is a transactional moment that you have, and maybe you're sitting across from a tax official, or maybe you're doing it online and it just doesn't work, or there is some misunderstanding, or you feel like the relationship is not one that works for you as a taxpayer. And for having, let's say, an awareness with the tax official and an awareness in the procedures, that's the moment when you really meet each other. It's not about having slick awareness campaigns. It's about having a fair treatment of the taxpayer when they actually are in the business of engaging with the tax administration. And I'm not really sure that we understand quite well how we would know that, or how we would correct it if we find it. But I think it's, when we talk about these things that we're talking about here, that's probably a pretty vital element of making the system work.
Mm-hmm. That all kind of leads to an issue that I think has been put forward or batted around a bit, although when we batted it around amongst ourselves, I think we all came up with similar views. But we've been speaking sort of informally about how the SDGs tie to TADAT, how TADAT and its POAs can be used to promote the SDGs, to try to reach the SDGs. Do you, from all your varying perspectives, think there's a role for a sort of, I'm not sure that expansion isn't the right word, but for actual formal indicators that try to somehow link these two things together, that is, measuring the extent to which this is successful or being undertaken? Does that make any sense, or is that not something that really makes sense from a TADAT standpoint? And I think, I know that Antje had some thoughts about that when we were discussing it yesterday and today.
Well, I mean, just from my experience from the technical advisory group, we always made a point very strongly that this is an analytical tool. So that's how it has also some capacity building. I mean, we talked a lot about the training sessions that the Secretariat has helped to do in a lot of countries. So there's some capacity building too. So it goes beyond the analytical perspective, but to also create some kind of, it's always the distinction between the analyzing, finding weaknesses, strengths, and then doing decisions, and especially tax policy decisions. I mean, this was always a very sensitive issue in the discussions, and so we may want to be careful.
Yeah, I was thinking of it maybe also in terms of a kind of, it's been sort of, a kind of monitoring role has been, I've mentioned, but I think Marijn had some thoughts on that
Right.
too.
Well, I think so. There are quite a few initiatives out there and ways of monitoring the relationship between tax and the SDGs. There are things being measured under the ADAS tax initiative. There is each year, and Vicky and I have a role in that, we produce this monitoring report for the Interagency Task Force, which has been renamed, but anyway, that is for the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which features directly into that. We have in the bank, we have for the IDA 18 replenishment, so that's the concessionary support for the lowest income countries. We also have tax worked into that. So there's a point at which it just becomes too much, and I think this would be one of those.
This would be that point.
I think at the same time there is this issue that we'll surely struggle with, which is that we may feel this way, but people outside who have access to the data may say, no, I think differently, and I will put this out there. For example, poor countries with weak revenue performance, subsequent TADATs have shown no improvement in the average scores. Well, I'm not saying that that's true, but suppose that's true, and use that as a way of dissembling the issue of the relationship between tax administration reform and the SDGs. So the fact that we all agree that it's not a good idea doesn't mean that others don't agree and that they will not use the data. So it's important to maybe be a little bit proactive in this and at least make the point clearly so that we're on record of warning against this.
Mary, I don't know if
Well,
certainly ATAF is pretty involved in a lot of monitoring of sorts, I think.
Yeah, well, for me, I think I'm a bit cautious, like Marijn said, but I think most certainly at the national level, KPIs would be very, very useful in terms of determining, of clearly showing, dividing roles, sort of like the division of labor. What does the revenue administration do? What does the government do? What do the development partners do? The different stakeholders, and then meeting from time to time to agree on how to take forward. So at the national levels, I think KPIs would definitely be, would be very, very useful. I'll give again an example of the work that we do. When you look at the countries that we go to where assessments have been carried out, it's very easy for us to say the revenue administration has done this regarding the TADAT report that was done on country X. What are you doing as the Ministry of Finance to help them have the necessary legislation in place, the necessary policy decisions? How are you supporting them, even in terms of giving them funds to carry out the necessary reforms? So I think at the national level, the KPIs, but at a higher level, I think would be more complex.
Let me add one thing, though. From the standpoint of a fairly small bilateral donor, when we have very finite resources, so when we decide to engage in a country to collaborate, one of the first things we look at is for each unit of money, dollars, pesos, doesn't matter, what's that likely to be used for? So there are many countries with fairly high capacity in tax, but very low achievement in meeting social needs. And there are others that are just the reverse. So if you have a finite amount of money to use to again collaborate with the developing tax administration, where would you spend the money? Again, this is probably not the case with multilateral donors because they need to be engaged everywhere. But for those with finite revenues and finite access, finite resources, this is one of the first things we look for. Now, there are various sources of information, and I just found this. There's something called sdtracker.org that has all kinds of information about the progress of countries against SDGs. There's the human development data that's on the website. So, so those are the things that we look at to see what the progress is of the country. Not necessarily whether it's low level or high level, but whether it's progressing. And you know, I think that's just very important. So that's it.
I think that's a very interesting point, because I think all too often when you say the multilaterals don't, well, the multilaterals actually do that, at least in our experience. We do certainly look to, and people here from the steering committees of the donor trust funds will I think well know that one of the criteria that would be used to see whether we should keep doing work with the government is, you know, are they doing their part, so to speak? How's it going? But maybe too often we look at the narrow question of how's it going in terms of raising revenue, how's it going in terms of improving the KPIs for the revenue administration. And you raised the very good point that in connection with the SDGs, well, generally, but the SDGs sort of place an umbrella over everything in terms of development spending. Really again, raising revenue is not an end in itself. The point is to spend it in a way that benefits society, of course. So I think that's a particularly good point. Maybe just to come back to some of the specific things a couple of you mentioned in your opening remarks. Both Bill and Marijn sort of spoke fairly specifically about a couple of aspects of the SDG, of the TADAT POAs that relate to aspects of the SDGs. And I know, let's see, Marijn was talking about kind of how you collect it, how you collect the revenue. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how that relates to the SDGs. What does it feed into? I mean, we have a sort of that phrase state building, but
right. So I mean, aside from the state building, for example, you have SDG 8, which has to do with economic growth that's sustainable and inclusive and employment. Now, obviously, if your tax system doesn't work to do that, or if it's in that sense very distortionary and has a detrimental impact on economic growth, then that would have a big impact on that. And that's partly tax policy, but it's definitely also tax administration, right? The tax policy can be right if it's not correctly implemented, then you still have your distortionary effects. Now, in SDG 16 has to do with really the governance side of things and having the society work. 5 has to do with gender, 10 with inequality. So there are all these aspects where tax has a major impact on what happens. It's not the only factor that feeds into this by far, but it's important to be able to look at and this goes a little bit back to what Mary was just saying. If you approach the SDGs from a very with a silo mentality, and you say, okay, if you want to meet education goals, we go and talk to the education system, the education ministry, and whoever is working in that, and the teachers. But of course, other aspects of the system, including tax, have a lot to do with that. And so, thinking about the relationship with the SDGs in this way opens you up to looking at the tax system more comprehensively. And there I come back to the MTRs. The MTRs invite you to have that comprehensive view by saying not just the direct parties involved in the tax system, the tax administration, the Ministry of Finance, and perhaps your mining ministry in case there's a lot of natural resource revenues, but you really want to look across your government and your society. And as Bill was just saying, it's about how the money is spent. So the education ministry should have a role in thinking about the revenue system because it will drive what they have to spend. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to say about that.
Antje, you had mentioned number 9, number 3, number 7. Maybe you might want to elaborate a little bit, especially I think in a session where I wasn't, there may have been a discussion of dispute resolution. So if there's already been a lot, don't worry, but I found that one particularly relevant, actually, maybe just because I'm a lawyer. But,
yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about the time frame, the 30 days or whatever, but it should really also be about the quality of the tax administrations need time to look deeper into a case, but at the same time, the taxpayer also needs some certainty in that he can be heard and that his rights are respected in the tax administration. And yeah, for taxpayers, this is really a big issue. And then also in POA 3, we talk a lot about the scope, currency, and accessibility of information. There was a big discussion about how much information should be out there and which way should it be out there. It needs to be easily accessible for the taxpayers. And then also, then you look at the next aspect, the scope of initiatives to reduce taxpayer compliance costs. It's also very important. It's a lot about electronic filing these days, but then you need access to internet to have that. And the tax administrations need to update their systems to be able to process these data. Yeah, so there are many aspects which it's good for tax administrations to think about these things and to have some guidance. I mean, it was often stated that the field guide really gives a good guidance to make the discussion and the thinking about it more objective, to know what would be a good practice and then have a discussion within the tax administration on how to get there. Yeah. Also the point of tax certainty, as Marijn mentioned, for growth aspects, it's very important. We stress this a lot in our G20 presidency in 2017. And yeah, obviously it is a big issue. Yeah.
Mary, I don't know if you or Bill have any specific. Maybe we could, I wonder if I could, I don't think I warned you about this specific question, but if each of you were, you can decide who goes first. If each of you were to be the leader of a TADAT assessment mission, sort of arriving in a, let's say, a low-income country, how would you go about trying to place a bit of an SDG framework on the work? Without a formal, let's say we've decided we're not going to have formal KIPs that relate to this, but how would you approach it when you landed there with your team?
Good question. Good thing you didn't warn us about this one.
I wanted spontaneity.
So I think I want to go back to something that I said early on, which is the taxpayer perspective. So I think I probably around the POAs, right? So for example, dispute resolution, right? So yes, you can have a discussion about how the system has been set up and how it functions, and find that everything is splendid because the processes are well defined and the resolution time is short, etc. And then, probably, especially if that's a short meeting and it doesn't take too long to find all that out, it might be interesting to then ask, okay, so how many people use dispute resolution? Do you have discussions with taxpayer groups about how the dispute resolution works? And do you know what their response is, right? Do you have a sense of, well, this taxpayer segment tends to be very happy, but here there are some people who are always complaining about this or that. So to kind of find out whether the tax administration has a good sense of what the clients in that framework, what their views are on the questions that you're asking. That would be one way of going about it.
I think that's good. I think that's great. I think before I got there, I would look at the country's development plans and see what what's expected? What's expected in terms of spending? And I would start out talking about here's what TADAT will do in terms of raising revenue, in terms of making the tax system more fair, even-handed, and appealing to business and development, and start that way. And I get this in part from Justin, who actually does that. So this is not a trademark approach.
I agree with Bill. That goes first.
Well,
Mary.
well, if I was leading, I would look at the development agenda of the country that I'm going to. I would then have a session where I have both the people who deal with the policy and the tax administrators in the room and say, if this is the objective and this is the development agenda of the country, how much money do we need to collect to get there? I would then tell them that for everybody to be able to get there, there are specific roles that each team needs to play. And I would then make sure that everybody understands what their task is and what their role is going to be, so that at the end of the day, the TADAT assessment and the results from that assessment, once obtained, will not just lay on the shelf, but instead they'll go straight away into being operational and then gaining the yields that are so expected.
Sounds very good. Hard for me to add something. Maybe just it's always good to open the dialogue, with the people in the tax administration. I think it's very useful for them too to really have some objective guidance on where they stand and to understand this is talking about good practices that have come from a lot of angles from the world into one document, and it's certainly always needs to be considered country-specific issues in it, but it's an objective guidance for them. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think we now have 15 to 20 minutes that we could open up for questions from the floor, if anybody would like to say something. Catherine, thank you. Please go to the mics and identify yourself before you ask, and you can address this to anybody on the panel.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Byer from the IMF. I just have two observations, I think, and maybe question for yourselves and also for the TADAT group. One has to do with the MTRS and changing the conversation or changing the focus of revenue raising from just doing better in terms of tax to GDP to what are the money going to be used for. And I led the first mission I had to MTRS to Uganda, and it really was a very different experience to couch the whole revenue, productivity, the tax system design and its administration and the legal framework from the point of view of, well, how much do you need to raise to finance your spending goals to, in the next 5 years. And so the context was very different. We usually have the little graph showing, why Uganda, and in the case of Guatemala, why are you stuck at, a certain percentage, 10 or 12 or 13. And in the case of Guatemala, the ministers had said to our area department, the mission chief, please just don't come down and tell me one more time, why I'm the lowest in the region, because that's really not going to do it. And I think we ourselves are a little exhausted with that focus too. And so it gives us an opportunity to really change the focus of our work to say this is for this. And in the case of Uganda, it was the 2.5% of GDP that they wanted for 2021-22, and it wasn't for social and education. It was for infrastructure spending, and that's what the government had decided. So we had the fiscal economist along in our team who was actually also racking his brains. How was he going to, quantify the needs? Because often they aren't quantified. We want to spend on this, but how much more? So it also imposes a bit of a discipline on the spending side. So what are the spending, and how much are you really trying to obtain? So I just wanted to share that I see the MTRS as being a real change in the focus of why are we strengthening the revenue side of the budget. The other thought I had was on the TADAT, and Marijn, you mentioned the taxpayer perspective, having worked in the Mexican tax administration and seeing that the administration was trying to become more transparent, but at the same time struggling with that, knowing that results of studies and of divulging too much information could be quickly politicized, make the administration look bad, but at the same time trying to be transparent. So conflicting objectives. And I wonder, I think for many countries also, there isn't an objective or well-informed assessment of the tax administration. The public, sort of the government accountability institutions are those who audit, or those who audit the tax and customs administrations are very weak, and they don't really know the business of the tax and customs administration. So often what they publish has to do with, does your form follow the regulation, ABC, but it doesn't look beyond to, are your processes robust, are your services good? And so this is really comes to substitute something in many countries that's not available in the country. It's a standardized and professional assessment of the tax administration. And so I wonder, just the fact of having an international team come to the country and do this assessment already means a lot. And maybe there's some countries that aren't at the stage of being willing to publish the reports, or they're not sure that, because everything is a D. But is there something in between that can be a public statement to the tax-paying public or through the media, saying we have submitted ourselves to this exercise. The results were mixed, or the results show that we have a lot of work to do. I'm just thinking out loud here, and I'm sure that those who have led the TADAT teams have a lot more experience in this, but that the process itself be a part of this transparency and accountability, and how can you convey that to the tax-paying public, without getting too into too much risky territory politically. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. I think those are a couple of very good points. If anybody on the panel want to just reflect on those, or the last one is a particularly tricky question, I guess, raises issues, but you've had a lot of experience with this, Mary.
Yeah, again, this is my very, very personal opinion. If I had to publish, say, a report of an administration that I was leading, and again, when answering this, I'll also borrow from the experience and the few cases that we've been involved in the TADAT assessment. I don't think I'd be so shy about having the Ds. I think what I would be telling everybody, and the story that I'd take there, would be the first, I think somebody mentioned it earlier on. No, it was actually in one of the videos where I think one of the Nigerian, the FIRS officers said, one way of resolving the problem is identifying the problem. So if I know that I have a D, I'll work towards getting an A. So I think what we need to tell the revenue administrations, and that's why earlier on I did voice the fact that I was a bit frustrated. I could not understand where the issue was in terms of wanting to alter the marking scheme so that revenue administrations look better. I think the more stringent and the clearer the result, the more incentive to try and obtain a better rating. And by so doing, then you're able to, one, provide the taxpayers with good services, two, raise your revenue base, three, raise your whatever, be able to meet your revenue targets, and four, feed into the development agenda. So, yeah, that's my thoughts.
And that's spoken as a former head of a revenue administration.
That's spoken as Mary.
Yes, but I think the experience is telling.
I don't know.
Both of you. I think.
Justin's standing over there. He might have an answer of the middle ground. I don't know, since we've never undergone a TADAT administration or assessment as a tax administrator, probably.
It's very interesting. It's a very interesting discussion. How do you involve? I mean, I'm paraphrasing. How do you involve civil society into this whole process.
Yes.
Okay, at the end of the day. And part of the process we go through as a TADAT secretariat and the authorities is to contact them well in advance. In fact, part of the demand for training that is coming out is we want to know what we are getting into. Mm-hmm. We want to understand how it will help us. I'm going to borrow from Mary, because we met about 3 weeks ago in South Africa. And one of the things that came out from that discussion, officials are finding the TADAT framework a safe place to discuss good practices without any hitback or repercussions from their seniors. And that's coming out very, evidently. I'll give you the example of Nigeria. In Nigeria, we've trained about 276 tax officials at the request of the FIRS, the Federal Inland Revenue Service. And of course, when we started the training, they were very cagey, but the TADAT methodology has a way of opening you up. You can run, but you can't really hide. And they started, a self-evaluation. Bill calls it a guided evaluation, self-evaluation. And when they started opening up, even their seniors who were in the room could not help by saying, they said, we didn't know this. It's these linkages that we are talking about. The POAs, the guide does not provide everything, but the linkages that, Canada has so ably demonstrated and have been refined are an issue. Empower, normally when we go on these capacity development missions, TA missions, we deal with executive management and probably 1 or 2 seniors, at the next level. Mm-hmm. But this actually goes down because when we're looking at the evidence, we go to the coalface. And I tell officials, even if you coached them during the field visit, it's very difficult to hide because we are running through the process. We've been told in the boardroom that this is that and the other, but we run through the process with the staff. And I pity one of them in Malawi who, when we were going through, and his bosses were there, but the bosses also saw that the process that had been prescribed is not, being practiced. So some of them have actually instituted education programs. In East Africa, which has had, I think, all of them, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi now, Tanzania, they now have, they have what is called an East African Revenue Authorities Technical Committee. Mm-hmm. They call it erratic. And that committee has now come up with a curriculum to infuse or embed good practice methodology based on the TADAT framework into the curriculum so that people down there at the lower levels can also, know what good practice is, and that empowers them or gives them confidence on the reform side of things. So that is one aspect. 3 weeks ago, actually, I was in Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe, an assessment is coming up. It's going to be led by Catherine and her team, yeah. But they wanted training. 140 staff were trained. I led missions to Zimbabwe on the TA side. And even though they see what needs to be done, it was not as structured as it should be. I expected some pushback from the authorities, at least the officials, in Zimbabwe. Amazing. They said, yeah, I think we are not doing very well, and they started opening up. They saw overlaps. So one of the things I've been thinking of as we're talking about SDGs and how do we relate SDGs or DRM to tax administrations, yes. Couldn't we follow a path that in any of the training, capacity building training that we do, because now capacity building is becoming part of the integrated with TA, technical assistance, couldn't we introduce modules that could link, the SDGs, the DRM, and those, high-level aspirations into some of these, tools and training and so on, so that by the time somebody gets out of that particular session, they know that, well, we didn't know this, silos, so this relates to what we should be delivering, to the SDGs and the. So, I mean, Rwanda has a very good practice. Every February, all officials and ambassadors and so on are put on a bus, and they are taken to some place, and they have to account, and there's that cross-fertilization. Why wasn't this done? Oh, I was depending on so and so. The integration is important. There's a lot to talk about this, but I'll give you a final example. Again, when introducing the human capital management, human capital risk issue, I went to the South African Revenue Services and met a human capital management specialist. He was actually meant to come here, but he was unable to. He used to work in a telecom company. And the story was that in one of these exchange rooms, they had bats in the ceiling. The key message she was trying to drive, how are we integrating all these strategies, processes, procedures? They had bats in the ceiling. And he said he found out for the first time that, I'm going to use this word, when the bats pee or excrete, they do so every 21 minutes. And they create ammonia, which goes into the exchange where staff were working. So they were trying to find solutions and said, okay, we need masks for the staff. Let's get rid of the bats as well. But getting rid of the bats meant that they were eating the mosquitoes, and the fruit flies. So you get rid of the bats, you solved that problem, but the mosquitoes are going to enjoy themselves. Okay? So they could bring the gas mask, but the problem will still continue. So what they did, he was talking about integrating all these, and this morning we heard about integrating tools, how do they link into each other. Then they said, let's build bat houses. They built the bat houses outside of the exchange. The bats migrated. So it was that integrated thing that they were talking about. So how can we integrate some of these expectations on the SDGs, DRM and so on, into the tax administration fabric? Finally, Bill talked about performance outcome area number 3, that is giving taxpayers information so that they can, comply with their obligations. It would be very good, even from the researcher's perspective, to find out, and we've talked to Christos about this before, all the media blitz, the communication, and so on and so forth, and huge investments. And people come and say, oh, we've done this, that, they check the boxes. Is that translating into revenue or productivity? And from the data we have, it doesn't show. It doesn't show. So what are we not doing right in order to increase that productivity and so on, even though we do the media blitzes and so on? I just wanted to share those thoughts so that, and the context in which TADAT could be related to SDGs and MTRs and all these other instruments.
Thank you.
And tax diamond.
Thank you, Justin, from the master's mouth here, who the leader of the TADAT leader certainly has done a lot of these. So Marijn was looking to respond in some way, I think.
I don't think we can have an event like today without a reference to the World Cup. So I'm going to do that. For those who are following it, and I'm actually not really, but I at least read about this one. My country is not represented, so I'm not. which is the fair play rule, right? So Senegal was kicked out because of the fair play rule.
What is the fair play rule?
The fair play rule is it's essentially a tiebreaker. So if you didn't win enough, right, you're evenly scored with another team when they decide about who goes to the next round, and you have the same amount of wins, same goals, same everything, right, which you normally would look at, then the rule that remains is who has the better performance when it comes to fair play. So that means least penalties like red cards and yellow cards.
They have an actual quantitative way of assessing who had better fair play.
Exactly. Now the reason I bring this up is because this fair play rule is very controversial, right? People are mad. Why did Senegal get kicked out? Because they played in a different way than, it was Japan, I think, that where they were evenly scored against. And
It sounds just like the IMF's soccer cup.
probably,
Our intramural
probably, yeah.
soccer, which doesn't necessarily bring out the best in everyone.
No. So the reason I'm bringing up, I'm going back to tax administrations now and the TADAT, right? So I think one of the reasons why TADATs have until now have had limited success in terms of having tax administration truly owning them in terms of publishing and really, you know, taking it and saying transparent about it. I know there's a lot of areas where I still need to improve. I think one of the reasons is because these tax administrations didn't necessarily know TADAT very well until it hit them, right? And the management was following different rules. They were saying they were following the rules that were laid out for them, which was, you know, raising revenues, meeting your budget target.
Calling people on the phone to ask for money.
Exactly, calling people for money and being successful at that, maybe hiring the right type of people, you know, because that's a bit political. No, they did everything right. And when they went to the cabinet and they had to explain their performance, they would say, I did great because I met the budget target, I hired the people that you tell me to hire, et cetera, whatever the rules are. And then suddenly there's this team coming in and saying, we've got a whole new set of rules for you. Fantastic, and you score really bad, right? So that is there's a corollary that follows from that. So my hypothesis is that as TADAT continues to be rolled out, as people get used to this being a framework, including these kind of initiatives in East Africa that Justin was talking about, where, you know, administrations and countries start owning the methodology, not just at the management level, but throughout the organization, I would expect that countries and administrations become much more comfortable sharing the data. Let's see whether that comes out, but I think that also demonstrates why that is such an important initiative to do, right? Sounds very expensive, training all these people, you know, and reaching out, and for these administrations then to sit together and compare notes and trying to figure out together what to think about it. But I think it's really, really important because it will lead over time to an increased acceptance of this instrument. We've seen a similar thing with PIFA, right, where it was initially not that many reports were published, then increased over time. You'll see the same thing here, I'm sure. But let's see whether my hypothesis works.
Well,
and I got in the World Cup, so I met my goals.
So I guess your hypothesis also goes not just to will administrations publish the report, but maybe the transition issue and changing from one set of incentives to what TADAT envisions as a positive best practice set of incentives, and that maybe there's the revenue take doesn't necessarily instantly follow from trying to switch to a better set of incentives, to use it.
But that's then a critical contribution to the SDGs, because I think if those incentives change in a manner that's consistent with TADAT, that would in itself already be a big step towards having
that is a step toward meeting some of the SDGs themselves, never mind the revenue.
Right, exactly, precisely.
Last words, because now we're actually out of time almost. So any last words? Question from Stefan.
Well, thank you. Thanks for this discussion. A comment and a question, because we're talking about the bigger picture here, how is TADAT linked to the SDGs?
Yes.
And also the kind of structure in the middle, which is revenues, public finance management expenditure.
Yes.
We call it collect more, spend better.
Yes.
So it would be a concrete question to you, Mary, about countries that are represented in your organization. How do you see the cooperation between the revenue side and the expenditure side and the public finance management side of the administrations? Is that something? Do they work together closely? Is that seen as one? How could I say, team that plays together and then in order to deliver a better service? And then perhaps the same question to the TADAT Secretariat and the PIFA Secretariat that are both here. To what extent do you work together? Thanks.
That's a good one. Well, to really answer your question, I think if I were honest, I would say no. There's really not much. Well, they work together in the sense that one side provides the targets, the other side goes and collects the revenue. But when you look at the actual, because when you look at the work that, say, TADAT does, it's about good practices by the revenue administration, by government, by all the different players. Now, in terms of the assessment of taxes, the collection of taxes, the revenue administrations try and do that, and they don't have much choice anyway. Now, on the other side, the accountability side, there's still a problem there. Because, again, I would like to use the example of Liberia, where they were trying to, when they were looking at the different steps and they were trying to implement the MTRs, it was interesting to see a room where the head of state and everybody who's somebody in government was present. There were the taxpayers, there were people from different counties. The discussion then was, oh, it's interesting to see that at last government is here to try and see how to better collect taxes, because the LRA was also launching its strategic plan. But when will we ever meet for government to tell us what they do with the money and to actually spell out every arm of government's role? For instance, when cases go to commercial courts, how do the judges treat them? Do you understand that by delaying a case or by ruling in a biased way, you're affecting the development agenda? So I think it's that kind of dialogue, that kind of discussion that should be ongoing. But in more countries than most, you find that link, that dialogue is really absent. And so what, say, ATAF is doing right now is trying to build that nexus between tax policy and tax administration, to tell them that actually to be able to get to that development that you want, there are a couple of actions that you need to do together. You really need to move in tandem so that when the right policy is put in place, then the administrative actions will also follow, and eventually everybody will be happy. Yeah, so there's still a bit of a gap.
Thank you. Any last thoughts before we close? I think we're starting even to run a bit over. Mm-hmm. So with that, then I just want to thank our panel and maybe give them a round of applause for agreeing to come and give us a stimulating discussion. So thank you.